All right, we're really doing this. We're finally talking about variables. And you clicked on this video because you want to learn what a variable is and how to use it within a flow. And I know several of you have asked to go over this one sooner than later. And the variable is pretty important to understand and to get a good grasp on so that you can start building effectively within flow. So I just want to break this down today in a very basic level, just like we do with all our other videos. And if you're looking at the left hand of the screen, I'm actually going to use kind of a cheesy example of what helped me start to connect with what a variable is. Depending on how you learn, for me personally, I'm a lot more a visual person, a visual learner. So for me, I like to kind of see an example of something so that I can picture it mentally of what's going on and what's happening. So that's what I'm going to do here in slide number 4. We'll get to that exactly what made sense to me when I was first trying to figure this stuff out and learn it. And then we're going to jump over to the actual flow, and we're going to build a couple of these out together so that after you understand what it is and what it's all about, you can actually go into flow confidently and understand where you're going to find it, how you set one up, what the possibilities are there, how you would kind of use it within just a quick get record element. So that's what we're going to cover today. Before I jump into everything, just like I always do in every single video, I want to reroute you back over to the blog site. So the blog site has anything from Salesforce stuff that we're talking about today, things that I'm doing in my career that are helping under the thoughts section here. I have a podcast around frequently asked questions in Salesforce, and then business application tools as well. Like Zapier and Slack and Tableau, stuff like that. But the main reason I always reroute you guys back here when I start off a video is because I will have a blog post for every single video that I put out. And when you click into these blog posts, you'll have all the documentation right here. So just like I said at the beginning of it, I know for me, I'm more of a visual learner, but some people would rather prefer just written word. So if that's you and you just rather read it versus watch the video, if that's easier for you, feel free to jump over here. It should all be there. I'll link the video at the very end so you can get to this YouTube video if you want to get back to it. So yeah, it's all right here. It's pretty much the only thing I want to cover and reroute you here for. So if you need to jump out of this and jump over here, feel free to do that. We're going to jump into the actual video portion of this now. Okay, cool. So I made a quick little presentation here. Figured that would probably be the easiest as we go through this. So breaking this down, we have a variable. You've probably heard the term. Maybe you don't know a ton about what a variable is. But it's needed within a flow, obviously. That's why you're here. So in order to kind of break that down for all of us, I wanted to first go over 2 definitions. Okay, so the very first one is just variable. What is the definition of a variable? I think that plays into what an actual variable is within Salesforce. It leans on those same lines. And then I also have the Salesforce definition here. So the regular definition of a variable from good old dictionary.com is capable of being varied or changed. And when you first think of variable, for me, the very first thing that came to my mind when I first started doing this was more of something like in math class, right? And it's exactly what this definition is saying, right? It's something that can be changed. That's the part you should focus on, is you have this thing, it can be changed, okay? And going into our Salesforce definition here, it says a variable is a container that stores a specific piece of data collected from the customer or output from Salesforce. So that gives a little more context of what this does in Salesforce, but that part at the very first one on the definition, the changed piece, that still applies to this Salesforce definition. Because what you're doing is once you're taking this container and you're storing something inside of it, the whole point of the variable is that it can be changed. So just much like you would put an item inside of a container or a shipping box is what we're going to talk about. You can change that out. You don't have to keep whatever's inside of that box permanent forever. It didn't make it like stay that way forever, right? If I want to store, what you've probably heard in past videos here is, if I want to store Christmas decorations, I grab down a box or a container, I label it, Christmas decorations, and then I store all the items inside of that. But just because I labeled it Christmas decorations doesn't mean that I have to keep Christmas decorations in there. Obviously, that makes sense because that's what I labeled it, but I can change it out. It's not permanent. I didn't seal it away. I didn't like weld this thing together. It's not unopenable now. I can always open that container or box back up, and I could put Valentine's stuff in there, or I could put, Halloween decorations in there. It's not specifically going to always be Christmas decorations, right? So it's the same idea within these two definitions. It can be varied or it can be changed, and it's a container. So if you take nothing else out of these two definitions, remember those two things. It can change, and two, it's a container or it's a shipping box, whatever one you want to think of. Those are the two most important things to grasp at this point, okay? So our third slide here is the types of variables that I wanted to talk about and types that are available. You have basically two types here. You have these custom variables that you can make, which allow you to make a custom one for like text, number, a Boolean is a checkbox, an object, date, time. You see them all right there in front of my face, so I don't need to list them all, but you get the idea. You have all these different items or customizations that you can use in these variables, right? So what that means is you can put that type of data inside the box, okay? Now, even though that we just said the variable can be changed, that's true. That's still true. But if I set up the data type as one of these, it has to stay within the parameters, okay? So let's kind of get a little into the weeds on this, and let's think about how you would ship an item, right? If you have, a container on a semi truck, if you've seen them around, right? Like they hold gasoline or they hold some type of like liquid chemical inside of them. That truck and that shipping container, it can technically hold whatever, but it's been designed to hold some type of chemical, right? It's set up to ship this type of liquid or chemical somewhere. And so that's what you're going to utilize that truck for. So you can store different chemicals in there and ship it accordingly like that, but it has to be a chemical, right? Because we're using that truck, we're using that type of shipping route, it has to stay within that parameter. Much like I believe there's like refrigerated shipping containers out there, right? When people are shipping stuff to like grocery stores, I'm sure, they use refrigerated shipping containers on a truck. Same idea, right? You could technically put other things in there, but because the parameters for that truck have been set up to ship something that needs to stay cooled, that's what they're using it for. So as long as it fits that category of, okay, yes, this needs to be cooled down, we can put it inside of this truck. So hopefully I didn't just lose you there, but it's that same idea. Try to apply that same concept to what these things mean. These are the data types that you can choose, okay? So if we set a variable up as a text, yeah, sure, we can technically fit whatever we want in there, but it does have to stay within that parameter after we create it. So if we chose text, we now have to ship text inside of that shipping container, okay? You could put whatever text you want in there and you can change that text whenever you'd like. But it does have to be text. So let's say we take like the account name and ship it in text. We could change it to, the opportunity name, but it would still have to be in text form. That's what we have to do. So it applies to all of these, right? So if we ship a checkbox, it has to stay a checkbox because that's what we've set this shipping container up to do, or the shipping box up to do. That's the parameter we have to stay in. So recap on that, it can be changed, but it has to stay within the parameter of the data type. The second one over here is this object type variable. And I wanted to include this one while we do this because, looking back at some of the early flows that I've done, I feel like I did too much work. Like I still did it in an effective way. It still got the job done, but I could have used these object type variables a lot sooner. And it probably honestly even would have been a little bit easier for me to understand what was going on. When I first started doing flows, I was under the impression that every single time that you wanted to ship something, you had to use a custom variable in like a text, a number, Boolean object, or sorry, not object, date time, something like that. So basically every time that you create this variable, I had to customize a new variable, name it something specific, and then ship it that way. Versus an object type variable allows you to store full records, as it says here, right? With all those fields. So the example that they use here is, let's just read this for example. So use a flow to retrieve a contact record. Store the record in an object type variable, which is what we have here. Then access one of the fields, such as name.id is a text type variable with restricted character count. So don't know if that helped you reading it out. I'm going to obviously show you what that means here in just a second when we jump over to the flow. But essentially what it does is instead of, let's say we wanted to create every single variable for every single field that you have housed on the account object. Well, like they said here, I need one for account ID. I need one for the account name. I need one for possibly the stage or close date or created date, last modified by. You have potentially hundreds and hundreds of fields, and it just wouldn't be realistic if you needed to do that, right? Like you're not going to go through and literally create 100 variables and name them account ID, account name, account created by, all this stuff, right? So if you're trying to basically bulk grab all the fields available onto that object, it's better to go with an object type variable, because what it essentially does is you just set out the parameter and say, hey, this is going to be a record type variable. And what that means is we're going to take a record that comes into our flow. We're setting the parameter. So much like we set a parameter over here to say, hey, this is a text, or hey, this is a number. Over here, we're just saying as the parameter, what object does this live on? That's it. And then it will do all the rest for you. It grabs all those fields and has a place to house new information and store information. Okay. So if that's the case that I wanted to bulk grab like everything off of the account, I would use this object type variable. And what it will do for me is say, what's your parameter? I say account. It says, great, we'll grab all the fields off of the account for you. And then what we're going to do is we're going to store all of those inside of those fields that you wanted to get the information of. Or if you want to store new data, you can easily do that because they're pre-created. Okay. So if that's not really hanging with you, don't worry about it. I'm going to jump over to the flow, like I said, and just a second here, and I'll show you exactly what that means. But those are kind of the two differences there that we're going to cover today. And then very lastly, this is kind of the way that was almost like the light bulb moment, I guess you could say, for me, when I started doing these variables and started trying to understand like what it was actually doing. It made a lot more sense when someone broke it down this way for me. So hopefully it does the same. We've talked a lot about shipping and containers and boxes. I like to think of it as like a packaging box. Okay. So you have a variable which equals this box. Okay. So you have this thing called a variable. It's this box. You ship something inside of it. So the way I think about it is when you first create the variable in a flow, think of it like an empty box with the lids open. Okay. So you've essentially created this variable. It's empty and there's nothing inside of it. So now you're going to put something inside of it. And then much like we have this little text box here, you can name it whatever you wanted. So if we wanted it to be the account name, right? We could name it account name, okay? And label it as such. So the reason I like to think of it as a box with the open lids is because it's empty. So much like you would package up your house if you're moving and you have these empty boxes that you're going to store stuff in, it's like, okay, great. I know I'm moving. I need a box. I need it to be empty. And I need to put something inside this box to ship it. Whatever I put in there, I'm just going to label it as that. Okay. So kind of think about it that way, right? Like we're shipping something from our home, we're packaging up our home. In the flow, we could put something like numbers up here inside of this. So let's just say this is, instead of the account name, we will say that this is the account ID because that's a number, right? Whoops. All right, so we have our account ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the account ID numbers. We're going to put them inside of here. This is now a numbers box or a numbers variable as the data type. We've labeled it as account ID, so we know exactly what we've stored inside here. Number two, what we're going to do is we're obviously going to seal that box up in a way, right? So you seal this box up, it's good to go. You know that inside of that box, it has just the account ID because that's what we named it. And we're going to ship it somewhere. We're going to hold it or store it. You don't necessarily always have to think of shipping it, right? Which is like sending it somewhere. But think of it as storing it for sure, because you put something inside of this variable, it's now stored there. So we have it sealed up, it's stored inside this box, it's up on our shelf, and it's there when we need it next, okay? So number three, either you're storing it or you're shipping it somewhere, if you think about it that way. And then number four is, okay, you've come to a point in your flow that you need to access that account ID that we just shipped. So what do we got to do? Well, we got to go and find the box that we stored called account ID, and we got to open it up. We got to get back to that account ID. And that's exactly what you do in a flow, right? You store it. Great. I created it. I stored it. Now later in the flow, let's say I use like an update element. Okay, well, if I'm updating something, I'm going to probably need to go and find this account ID, open it up in number 4 here, and pull out the account ID so that I can access that within the flow. So that's essentially what you're doing. Hopefully that makes sense. It's like 4 easy steps, right? Or even 3, you could say, if you're just storing it. You essentially have an open box, which is you creating a variable. You choose what you want to store inside of that variable. Sorry about that. You keep it stored somewhere within your flow. And then when you need to access it within an element, you open that box back up and take out the information you stored inside of it. That's what a variable is. That's all it is. And that's the easiest concept to think about it in, I would say, right? There's obviously other things that go along with this that you'll find out, but the very basic, most easiest for me to understand idea is that right there. Is we have this box that we're storing, has information in it, and if I need it, I got to open up the box and access it, okay? So that's kind of our example that I'm going to review. Getting over to the flow now, let's actually create one of these, okay? Where do I go? Maybe that's the very first question you have. Like, how do I actually create one of these? Well, you got 2 tabs up here, okay? So you have one that's called Elements, and you have another one that's called Manager. And on that, you want to click on the Manager one. Now, the Manager tab, this allows you to create different things in here, new resources, okay? So I'll hit New Resource. And when I hit New Resource, the very first one that pops up is this variable that we're talking about. I can click on that variable, and let's say this first one is going to be our custom one, okay? And what I mean by custom is this one. We're going to choose to create one of these individually that we need specifically. Sometimes if you want to do it this way, it's more of like maybe you only need to grab 1 or 2 things for your flow. This might be a way that you choose to go versus storing all of them inside of an object and accessing it later. If you maybe only need to, grab 1 or 2 things, this is an easy way to do it. So in our case, let's just stick with that example that we wanted. And let's name it account ID. I obviously want to name it something or label it. The API name, think of it as your shipping label. I'm labeling this box as account ID so that I know what's stored inside of it. Will be the account ID. And in my description, I usually say that. I say this stores the account ID, right? If it's not obvious by your name, it should be obvious by your description. Now for the data type, what is our account ID? Well, we said it's a number, so we need to store a number. Do we need decimal places? Yes or no? We do not. Okay, great. And we can now store this. Now there's a couple other things you can do in here that we're not going to get into in this video. One of those is to allow multiple values as a collection set. I'm not really going to on this one since we're just trying to get the basics of the the variable itself. But within this one, you have two options, available for input and available for output. Okay. And the most important one is that you have this available for input. So we're going to select that. I'll cover this section in another video along with this. And the other option that you have here too is if you know that this box is going to have a specific default, we could also set it as that. You could set up a specific default. Like if I always knew that this was going to be the number 2 that I wanted to store here, I could do that, right? So it does allow you to put in a default value, which is nice. But typically, you're probably, if you're new to this, going to be setting it up this way. You have your variable, you've named it, you've described it, it's available for input. Great, that's it. And you created it. So now we have this number parameter. It tells me it's a little number, and I can ship numbers within this. Let's say if I wanted to store a different ID or even just a different number, I could ship it inside of this. It'd have a funky label, but I could still technically do it, right? Or if I needed to, maybe grab a pre-existing account ID and now I'm assigning a new account ID to it, I could use this variable here and change it within the flow using some elements to something else, right? I could update it to a new value, or I could assign a new value to this, which is typically more of what you would see, okay? When it comes to that changing part of it. All right, now let's hurry and create one more. And let's actually create this as the record one, in case you didn't understand that. So this one is a little different for me personally that I like to do on my naming convention. The last one, we named it something specific, account ID, because I'm storing specifically the account ID. Now in this one, since our only parameter basically is going to be what is the object, I want to name this something a little bit broad. Like if I'm going to grab the information on the account, I'm actually just going to name this account. And I'll show you why here in a second. This stores the object account records or fields, let's just say. All right, and now we have obviously our little data type here. Now, when you wanted to get to the object one, you'd probably be thinking, okay, where's the object one? I don't see object on here. It's actually under record, because what we're going to do is when that record comes in, we're going to store all the information on that record for a specific object. So you click record as your data type, and then this little object guy pops up. And here, this is where we can actually clarify, yep, we want to grab our account. Available for input. Done. Okay, so now I have this record single variable called account. And it's really nice, right? Because I can access this bad boy inside of an element. Let's say I wanted to get more information on this account. Okay, well, I could easily do something like this. I could say, yeah, let's grab the billing city on the account. Okay, where do you want to store that? And I essentially have this option now, if I choose to store this all like in a record, right? To grab our account and drill in. See how that worked? So if I were to type this out even, I would do my exclamation account. And then as soon as I put that dot, it allows me to drill into it. Now, when I drill into it, look at this. It has all of the actual data involved that we need to actually use. So anything on the account is now available here for me that I can actually store something inside of. So if I'm grabbing that billing city, well, it's probably common that I want to put it in the billing city. If I'm grabbing, Who knows? Any one of these, right? Facts. I can do that same thing. I can go to my account. It puts the dot for me, and I can put facts, right? And it will work that same way for every single one of these. Okay, I want to grab, website. I want to grab the website and store it inside of the website. So now that I have this, everything is now being stored in a way that would make it easy to understand. Now, the reason I named it account and not something else, look, if I change this to, let's just say, random, you can name it whatever you want, right? But now look, when I go back here, that can make you get a little confused because you're like, okay, what? I'm storing this inside a random.facts. Like, I don't know what that means. So the reason I choose to do that is because when you do stuff like in a process builder, and you have to access these different things, like that's the way that it reads, right? Is it'll say account dot the field, like object dot field. So the reason I named it account is so that it makes sense to me to say, oh, this is the account object stored inside of this field. So that's the way I'd recommend doing it. That's what makes the most sense to me. Now, if we wanted to do something different, right? Like we wanted to grab, let's try to throw another element on there real quick. So if we grab another, I don't know, like an update record here. Let's just say account update. And let's specify, let's go to the account since that's what we're using here. We'll just say the date equals today so that we have that current date. Great. And now we have these different fields that we can store something in. Okay, so let's say that we want to grab that bill, or what is this one? It's a number. Let's see, ID maybe, owner ID. Okay, so now we have our little guy that pops up here. All right, so we have, let's actually just make this a little bit easier for you and do account ID, or I think it's probably just ID. It's on here. Okay, whatever. Let's actually just, for the sake of this example, we'll keep it as our owner ID, all right? So we have our owner ID, and because this is a number field that it's going to be pulling, this will then allow us to access our number field that we made here. So even though this is stored as account ID, I could actually select this one because it's also a number variable. It's a number data type, and I could store or update this owner ID into this field and store it within this little shipping box. Okay, so same idea though, if you saw earlier, if we grab like a date, I can't store, look, it doesn't appear for me to store it inside that option because it's going back to that truck idea. It's saying, well, you set this thing called account ID up as a number box or a number truck. So it doesn't fit the parameter to store a date inside of it. It's not designed to store a date inside of it. So I can't actually store it inside of there. And the same would go for any of those other data types, right? If I store it or set it up as like a currency or set it up as a date, then obviously I'm not going to be able to put a number one inside of a date. I'm not able to put a date inside of a currency field. So that's the way that that works, and how those variables are all set up. So hopefully that gives you a good idea between those two to kind of get your hands around what a variable looks like.